The views, information, and opinions expressed during the following program are solely those of the individuals involved and do not necessarily represent the views of Access Communications, its representatives, or its employees.
The RCMP Heritage Centre is a not-for-profit charitable organisation mandated to share the story of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. This is one of those stories, part of your heritage.
When I returned from Haiti in 1995, I was called by staffing and asked if I was still interested in a posting to depot, which I had put in for more than once over the years. And when I said, well, yes, of course, they informed me that there was a position open for a bilingual member in the driving unit at depot, and that I was to present myself then for an interview board. The structure had just been adopted by the force that an exam had to be taken. I had taken that exam, got the requisite mark, and was flown to Vancouver because though it was now 1996, early 96, the Cycle 1 board had been dissolved in K Division. So did I mind going to British Columbia because they still had a board? I was being asked this. I'm sorry, it wasn't 96. It was November of 95. I said, I don't know, let me think. Fort McMurray, November 95, a weekend in a nice hotel for a Monday morning appointment in Vancouver. I'll take it. Happily, I was selected to come to depot. And I served as a driving instructor for, 3 years or so. And during which time I was also cross-training as a drill instructor, and then was given a troop, one of several, of course, but that presented itself for its first hour of drill on the 12th of May, 1999, Troop 3 of that year. I remember it well. I call it the fall of 99, although it was only May. And what happened was that, terrified as they were, I had sized the troop and formed them into two ranks. But of course, the rear rank was far too close to the front rank. And I aligned myself alongside the right marker and informed everybody on the troop, who could only listen but not look at me, head and eyes front, that henceforth the distance between the two ranks would be 3 paces. And 3 paces will look like this. And I set out to march off the 3 paces. 1, 2, and what should have been a nice sharp 1, 2, terminated with a loud crash, because on that halting movement, I slipped on the drill hall floor, landed very awkwardly. 180 pounds of me landed on my right knee, which was directly underneath my body. It destroyed the knee and robbed me ultimately of the dynamic function of my right leg. I can't to this day hop, skip, jump, run. But on that day, the troop didn't know what was going on. They just heard this clatter. There was a second drill instructor on the floor, so he ambled over that. In those days too, the troop actually had a videographer videoing their first drill class and all the milestone events in training. So I have the video of the first 5 minutes of their drill class. And it shows the other drill corporal, who shall remain nameless, stroll over and look down at me rather sort of bemused, like, what are you doing down there? And apparently, I don't recall doing it, but I looked up at him, and in fine British stiff upper lip tradition, and of course of the mounted police, I said, I believe I've hurt my knee. Please carry on, Corporal. So he said, very well, and carried on with the class. Meanwhile, others had come down from the bleachers. There were other instructors there. The drill sergeant of the day was there, Bob Stewart, and a colleague from the driving unit was also sitting up there, and Greg Crawford. They came down to assist me. I had now already made myself famous with the "carry on, corporal" remark. The next thing I did apparently cemented my reputation around the base, because of course they wanted to get me off the floor while this class was going on around me. And I had visions of having to go to hospital and have my highbrows removed. And of course, that meant potentially that the boot would be cut off. As had happened to a troop mate in training, Ken Alderson had fallen down, and I accompanied him to the Pasqua, where in the ER they pulled out a huge pair of shears and cut his highbrows off. And we all shuddered back then in 1982. And that flashed through my head. I remember thinking, no, I've just spent days and there are 35 coats of polish on these boots. They are mirror-like. I can't have that happen. So I said to Greg, save my boots. Take my boots off. Don't let them cut my boots. He said, are you sure? I said, of course I am. So he tenderly took a hold of my heel and straightened my leg out so that he could take the boot off. That was excruciating. I mean, my kneecap was round behind and back of my knee, but by pulling my leg straight, he inadvertently but happily performed a sort of traction that pulled everything kind of back into place. Though I didn't know at the time, I had completely torn the patella tendon, the main tendon that connects the upper leg to the lower leg and holds the patella in place. And Greg, being a good policeman, had with him an all-purpose pocket knife, so he whipped it out, took off my spurs, and cut the laces in the front of my highbrows, and then gently, but oh so painfully, eased the boot off my leg. Okay, so far it's been carry on corporal and save my boots. They carried me over to the drill hall office, put me on the floor because I couldn't sit anywhere, it was just too painful. Ambulance attendants arrived and they determined that I really should go to hospital, tout de suite. Well, then one of them wheeled over a large canister and went to put this face mask over me and said, this is nitrous oxide. It's a nice mellow gas. You'll feel okay and no pain. It'll just make you feel a little woozy. My wife that day was in Ontario attending the funeral of her grandmother and her uncle, both of whom who had died in the same week. And I was in charge of our two then young teenage daughters here at home, neither of whom knew what had happened yet. Greg Crawford was our neighbor as well as a colleague on the unit. So I said to Greg, okay, you have to tell the girls what's happened. And to the ambulanceman, I said, no drugs. I got to keep a clear head. Decisions have to be made. No drugs. So apparently those three things all at the same time made me, briefly anyway, if not famous, certainly infamous around the base, because Greg ran around and told everybody, oh gosh, you should have seen him, what a mountie. That said, the injury was such that it effectively ended my operational days, and so the force did what it could to ensure that that didn't mean the end of my career with the RCMP, and various positions around depot were identified for me subsequently as being things that I could do that didn't need me to pass the pair test or otherwise meet the same requirements as would be necessary to go back out to the field. Among the positions that I occupied after drill, the first was that of public relations, media relations officer. The unit was then called public relations, but within a year was renamed communications and events management services, and its mandate somewhat expanded. And so for 3 years, I managed those sorts of affairs at depot. But somewhere in about the second year of that, so around 2002 early 2003, my then line officer, Inspector Donna Brownlee, gave me a file and said, this is the file on the group of proponents that want to establish a new museum. They're calling it the Heritage Center, the Mounted Police Heritage Center. They want to maybe call it the RCMP Heritage Center. They mean well, and the force supports it, and she, Donna Brownlee, have been managing this up till now, kind of, because she had to identify it as part of a long-term site development plan that she had been working on for more than a year. But her mandate with the site development plan had now expired, and she had become the support services officer for Depot, and she just knew that she wasn't going to be able to give it the attention it required. Somehow she thought that I could instead, as if I didn't have anything to do. So she gave me the file and said, meet with these folks, get to know who the players are, and basically see what you can do to keep them kind of happy, give them such assistance as you can, and let's try and move this thing forward to the extent that we can, because clearly it's a useful initiative, but there's a lot of questions to be answered. And to be frank, that file sat kind of on the corner of my desk for about a year, because literally I was putting in 16-hour days for many days, particularly in the summer months and weekends. And I was just, darn it, too busy to give it the full attention it needed, which at the time wasn't really too bad, because the Heritage Center group itself wasn't moving forwards very quickly. The consultant group that was handling it was managing it sort of a day or so a month, I think, on their desk too. And so everything was moving, but at a glacial pace. And at that time, the entire file anyway was for the RCMP being overall looked after by the Deputy Commissioner of the Northwest Region. And the Deputy Commissioner at the time was Steve Duncan. And Mr. Duncan had fallen quite gravely ill during his last year as the Deputy Commissioner. And frankly, I'm quite sure that it didn't receive a lot of attention at the Deputy's office either. So there was sort of an alignment of the stars when Deputy Duncan left the position, and Deputy Jerry Brown was brought into the fold. He was appointed Deputy Commissioner of the Northwest Region, and so he looked through the files on his desk and found this one about the Mounted Police Heritage Center and asked the CO of Depot, what's this about? The CO asked Donna Brownlee, and Donna Brownlee said what it was, and the deputy said, well, if we're behind this and we're supposed to be moving it forwards, I don't want to just have a file on my desk that doesn't do anything. Let's move it. So let's find somebody to take care of the business. And even Donna had said to me that it seemed clear that they had in mind that, as had the proponents themselves, they wanted a heavyweight. They wanted someone in the RCMP, a corporate heavyweight, superintendent or better, who could make decisions and take care of business. But both Donna and the then CO, Kurt Tugnum, recommended to the deputy that Steve Smedley would be the guy, because he'd already had the file for more than a year. He knew the players, as I did, and knew the issues, as I did, and was quickly getting a grasp of who was who in the zoo in the RCMP. Commissioner Zaccardelli was a very great champion of this whole initiative. So between the commissioner, the deputy commissioner, and for that matter, Inspector Brownlee and Chief Superintendent Tugnum, I ended up as the RCMP's project manager, coordinator, the front door for the Heritage Centre Corporation to speak to gain access to the RCMP. And to some extent, I had to be not only the facilitator for the good things that were being proposed, but was also the face of the RCMP that said no to the things that the RCMP either didn't want or couldn't live with or simply had absolutely no appetite for. And prior to my involvement, Donna had been very forthright, very firm in that position. And so for a year or so yet, after 2004, it was spring of 2004 when I was asked now to take on the job full time. That more or less coincided with Donna Brownlee's retirement in 2005. In 2005, quite clearly, the Heritage Centre Group, the main players, had discovered that no matter how much we were trying to help them out, their project just wasn't moving very quickly at all. And they were having some issues with their own consultant group. They felt that they needed somebody to take the bull by the horns, kick ass, take names, and just get things moving. And they were asking around. They had in mind a number of candidates to be their new chief executive officer under their new corporate structure. They wanted to do stuff, but they still couldn't find anyone who would take the gig. So I proposed to them that an ideal candidate might be the recently retired Inspector Donna Brownlee. Who better than her, who knew everything about this project and who knew the workings of the RCMP too. And there was some initial reluctance because they'd been hard dealt with by Donna. In fact, I think one or two didn't want Donna at all. But once they met her and spoke to her, they realized that what I had suggested might be just the ticket. My suggestion being, I know that you think that she was a bit hard on you all, but she was protecting the interests and ensuring the integrity of the program for the RCMP. Now she is not beholden to the RCMP. Take that same energy, that same drive, and turn it round and make it work for you. Because I'll be the guy that now has to deal with Donna. And I don't much relish that. And happily, they had some negotiations and Donna was brought on board. And I have to say that, arguably, of course, but that was the best decision that they made at that stage of the evolution of the development of the Heritage Centre. Because Donna completely revitalized the program. She re-energized everybody and completely satisfied the requirements of the board at that time to get this thing developed, designed, and built. And on the day that it opened, she stepped down as the development CEO. I stepped down as the RCMP's project manager. So effectively on the 23rd of May, 2007, both of us were more or less out of a job, although the RCMP had seen to it by then that I was by then on a small team that was charged with the infrastructure renewal at the Academy. Apparently when the director of that group, the National Project Delivery Office, was put in place, they brought him in from Winnipeg, and Kevin Searle was told, okay, you're in charge of the stuff that's happening at Depot. There's a sergeant sitting around there too. He's only building one building, so if he hasn't screwed that up too badly, you can have him to help with the other dozen you're doing or whatever it was. So my service with the RCMP in particular taken as a whole, was a satisfying experience, and one that I wouldn't swap for the world now. There are some regrets. One always has a few, as the song says. I remember as a Gloucester policeman driving around the east end of Ottawa, actually the eastern suburbs of Orleans and Blackburn Hamlet, the area that I was responsible for. And in the late 70s and early 80s, new subdevelopments were being built, and Peggy and I, my wife and I, went out there and we shook some timbers and kicked a few doorposts and said, gee, I don't know, new house, $40,000 is a lot of money. And okay, so a number of my Gloucester colleagues bought houses there and paid them off 20 years ago. Their kids have all grown up in one place, all of the stuff that municipal policemen, of course, enjoy. I was disappointed, and it still lingers a bit that the force chose to leave me in Wainwright for as long as they did, despite my many entreaties after 3 or 4 years that, you know, maybe it's time I moved on to something else. So staying there in that first posting for that long didn't augur well for my career, I thought. I wasn't terribly happy with that. But then to have been selected to go on the United Nations mission, and not one but two, were for me the epitome of what international policing is all about, of interagency cooperation. The first mission was exclusively RCMP. The second one was RCMP and just in '95, the very first of some municipal police officers from elsewhere in Canada began to join the Canadian contingent then, as opposed to just simply an RCMP contingent. And I was able, as a long-time member of the International Police Association, to benefit from, both personally and professionally, the interaction with police officers from all over the world who had not just different, obviously different cultures, but different policing perspectives, different attitudes, different methods. By and large, we Canadians were held in very high regard because we were generally, but not exclusively, among the best educated, the best equipped, the best prepared for the missions that faced us. But to some extent, I've always been mildly disappointed in the RCMP's earlier adherence to a culture that suggested that it was superior to everybody else. Yes, we do fine things. Yes, we have great training programs, and the people are excellent. But institutionally, there's a sort of an institutional arrogance that I've always tried to counter by reaching out to police officers from around the world, and even more locally, right next door to us, here in Canada. Famously, I once spoke to my own division staff relations representative on the telephone, asking him if there had been, this is back in the early mid-80s, if there had been any movement yet on the long-promised portability of pensions, so that police officers joining the RCMP from within Canada, from other forces, might be able to bring with them their pensionable service, which was not and still is not the case, although there's been some movement on it recently. And I remember his response to this day, and it has always left a bitter taste, and it was, well, you should have joined the RCMP in the first place, and then we wouldn't have this issue. So of course I pointed out that when I first became a policeman, they didn't have any detachments in England. Not that I was looking for that service to be counted, but I just wanted to make my point. He said, and moreover, he said, you were with the Gloucester police. Who's to say that's a bona fide police force? There's a lot of Mickey Mouse outfits out there, you know. So I just said, you know, I'm sorry you feel that way, because in some regards, because none of us is perfect, some of those so-called Mickey Mouse outfits can make the RCMP look pretty Mickey Mouse. So we're not, that good. Let's leave room for improvement all the time. But the crowning, for me, the crowning glory was that nobody saw me overseas in Namibia or in Haiti as a guy with a British accent. They saw me as a member of the RCMP and as a Canadian. Nobody ever, I was never once questioned about the fact that I was in the Canadian contingent and yet sounded as though I was British, except by the other Canadians themselves. So it was a great validation of my Canadian citizenship for me. Up until then, it had been something of a political expedient to get my citizenship so that I could join the RCMP. And only slowly, it took several years after joining, did I begin to become Canadian. And once I was identified outside Canada by others as the Canadian, that's when I really felt as though I had made it. I belong. I've never been so proud and will never be so proud to be Canadian.